So I want to talk a little bit before we get into your charity and the work that you do there, just to paint a picture of what the understanding of autism is like in Canada. And you're from Toronto, correct?
We are, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So maybe could you describe how the understanding has changed in Canada since your sons were diagnosed?
sure. The story I think that best relates to this is, when you think in terms of long-term time spans, 20 years ago doesn't seem like ancient history. It's not 50 or 100 years ago. And our first son, Jake, was diagnosed. We have a world-renowned hospital here in Toronto. It's the Hospital for Sick Kids. And they help parents like us. They do a 2-day evaluation. This is 20 years ago. Things have changed dramatically since, but I'll take you back to the time when we were diagnosed. And you do 2 4-hour sessions with your son, and then they ask you to come back so that they can give you the diagnosis alone. So when we went back, and just to show you how much it's changed, Jake has subsequently been diagnosed with autism. His initial diagnosis was PDD, pervasive development disorder, which is, again, autism is a very wide spectrum. It would certainly be characteristics that fell within the autism range. So the clinician talked to my wife and I and said he has PDD, it's a form of autism. And of course, we had no idea what that was. We hadn't heard of it. It wasn't anything that we were familiar with. So they explain it to you and you ask a lot of questions. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of answers. He's 3 or 4 at the time. Will he be able to go to school? Don't know. Will he ever talk? Don't know. Are there therapies we can get to help him? Don't know. So I just recall that particular day walking outside with my wife, standing on the corner of the hospital, and I'm sure there was hundreds of people walking around us. But at that particular moment, we felt like we were the only 2 people on the planet. It was a very, very hard day. You feel
Mm.
like the child you thought you had is gone. And so it's also something we incorporated is to try to have our charity so that any parents who are leaving any hospital don't feel like that. Thankfully, in Canada, and again, 20 years is not a long time, but I would suggest to the credit of a lot of people that the overall perception of autism has been much more supportive. That people just didn't know when your kids were in a park, and unfortunately, I'm a fairly good sized person. My wife is a tall lady; she's 5'11", so our boys were always heads and shoulders above other children, and somewhat noticeable when their behaviors had them behind other children's and typical. So my wife was always at the park. My son wouldn't understand that there's an order to the slide. You have to let the child in front of you go, and because his cognition wasn't there, and parents were cold. And my wife would say he's autistic, and even at the time, as silly as it sounds, people thought she was saying artistic, and she says, "Well, what does he's being an artist have to do with it?" She goes, "No, it was very, very frustrating." For not just my
Mm.
wife, but for thousands, tens of thousands of moms and dads like my wife and ourselves. So, but I would have to say that it's very impressive that in a short period of time, in the 20 years that we've learned about it and we've watched it, it's miles different. And I'll get into this a little later on. Where we find the optimism is not in our generation, but is in the generation behind us. Our generation, my mom still has a hard time understanding, well, maybe they're not autistic. It's like, yes, mom, they are autistic because, maybe there's always a quick fix. And it's cultural, it's generational. And I found that from our generation down, there is so much more acceptance, which leads us to an enormous amount of optimism. And that's amongst the many things that we try to do. That's what we try to share with parents who are just having young children being diagnosed. You have a family and you have somebody who's 2 or 3 years old now, and they're limited. They're not going to be able to do this. No, don't think about what they can't do. Think about what they can do. So yeah.
Hmm.
So I would say that in 20 years, it's been enormous strides, all in a good. There's always room for improvement, but enormous strides towards it in a positive direction.
Is there any kind of stigma around mental health in general in Canada?
Um, I think that as with any subject, education is the key. I always thought that awareness was something that was misused or overplayed, and maybe not awareness, but maybe education. So, and I'll give you a good example. Jake has been volunteering at my old high school for probably 5 or 6 years now. And I remember doing an experiment. He's in a leadership class. An amazing teacher. Her name is Nadia Pasquini, and she runs all of the leadership. And Jake has been part of their class for, let's say, a couple of years now. And so I went in and I talked to all of the kids who were all familiar with Jake in the school environment. And I said, "You're all comfortable with Jake." I was talking to a classroom of about 30 kids. And all, again, these are individuals that want to help. So they're inclined to, push a little bit more. And I said, "So you all feel comfortable with Jake in this school?" I said, "There's a gas station 15 minutes down the road. If I asked one of you to take Jake to the gas station and I'll pick him up in a half an hour, how many of you would feel comfortable?" And not a hand went up. And it's because as soon as we would take him out of the familiar environment, they were like, and I said, "Okay, now I'm not, I understand. Please share with me why." "Well, I'd be afraid. What if he decided to bolt? I can't talk to Jake. I'm not in the environment." So what we've learned is that education, like I have 3 boys, they're all fantastic. But I can tell you, far and away, the most difficult child we have is our oldest. He has ideas, he has this, he has that. And I say that in a positive way. Jake and Jonathan are so easy to parent, simply because my wife took a very positive approach of adapting to a certain degree. There's no temper tantrums allowed, there's no misbehavior. But if they'd like things structured a certain way, my wife was good enough and I think wise enough to do that. Once you become familiar with that, taking care of our boys is they're both angels. But if you didn't know them, Rachel, and I said to you, "Can come in," Jake is 6'3" and 300 pounds and doesn't say a word. So you're now looking at this very large young man. You have no idea that he needs his dinner in an hour, and it's all simple if you know it. So getting back to your original question, it's the education of trying to explain to people that once you understand, and the challenge, as with all of us, is we're all different. So my son Jonathan's needs are couldn't be more different than my son Jake's needs. But to prove my point, they're all completely different than my son James's needs. They're all different. So I think as parents, it was just the acceptance of understanding that your children had different parameters, and once you found their comfort zones. And again, there's none of this credit goes to me in our particular household. This all goes to their mom, who studied and learned and took all the basic parenting instincts and had to throw them out the window, to be honest with you, because you have to learn a whole new set of them. And she was incredible in being consistent, being firm, because it's a child is still a child. A 6-year-old is going to try to do whatever they can, autistic or not. So it was very hard for her to walk that fine line as to where does she give tolerance and where does she apply discipline or control. And I think she's done a marvelous job. And one of the benefits of our charity is that my wife has gotten to talk to thousands of other parents who really have simplified parenting. And once you learn, put the child's needs first, set a basic rules of parameters. We all know our children. It worked out pretty good.
Did you guys receive any support? Were either of them getting any therapies?
So at the time, we did try speech therapy and occupational therapy. Now, when you say support, at the time there was no government support,
Mm-hmm.
so you paid for it, and we found some incredible, incredible people in those industries. The occupational therapist that we had for Jake and Jonathan, a lovely woman by the name of Paula Aquino, couldn't have been nicer. I think the challenge for therapists, and it's very difficult, is that as a parent with a newly diagnosed child, you see them as the beacon and the banner of hope. That while they're a speech therapist or they're occupational therapist, they're the cure. And I think what's very challenging and what we liked about Paula was that she was very practical in her expectations. That sometimes a journey of 6 inches is just as important as one of a mile. But for
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan or for Jake, and maybe Jake can't even make the journey to the foot line. Maybe Jonathan can, but Jake can't. And I think that was the other thing is that the severity and the condition that the children all develop, there are therapies that will help 18, 20, 25%. There are some that will help others. But I think as a parent, you always have to be careful to know that cures and magic treatments and And, well, why aren't they talking? They've been in speech therapy for 3 years. It just might be the way that child's, DNA is. So, yeah, so we did
Right.
try. We were satisfied that we tried to get all the resources we can. Back in our day, there weren't government supports. Now, today, there's many, many more, thankfully. But what we caution parents about is just measure your expectations.
Mm-hmm.
The condition of your child might not suit a certain program, but by all means, get out there as a parent and try every one you possibly can. So, just keep your expectations in check, I think, is just common sense.
You've been watching Autism Knows No Borders. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so let us know what you think in the comments section. Click here to watch this interview in its entirety. You can also find us on your favorite podcast app. Tune in each week for engaging conversations of how people across the globe are inspiring change and building community. Thanks for watching. Take care.